This is very much in the spirit of engagement and also a research project which is well underway. We've been at it for 4 years. You've got a monitor there and you've got a monitor there. And what we want to do is use you to actually help us down the track of where we're going next. So it's very much in that spirit, but what we also want to do is share with you where we've got to. On a project which I never believed we would be at, but it is about thinking the unthinkable. And of course, unthinkables you can't think about because otherwise they wouldn't be unthinkables. But I started down this track and we go back, Heather and I go back a long way, and she just reminded me, that I used to work in television. And that's where many of you will remember me from, probably on BBC World News, but I decided 4.5 years ago to leave. And as I was leaving, things began to happen. And that's where this project started. I wasn't planning on playing golf. I didn't retire, but I wanted to do different things. But then other things were happening. So what we want to stimulate you down, and Chris has already had some conversations with some of you about the nature of what you're doing and the expertise that you bring to the table and the expertise that you have and maybe the frustrations on how you prepare for unthinkables and do it smartly. I just want to get you out of the mode of having a glass of wine and talking to your neighbour and having a good conversation, because to get into the depth of what we're trying to get at, it's about how leaders are failing and why they're failing and why you're frustrated with them. And that's where I set out from. I've had 40 years in the business of being a senior journalist, or junior when I started, but in many nasty parts of the world, including particularly in Eastern Europe. But we are talking about these things. Brexit, Trump, migration, Russia, but why leaders are losing the plot on multiple issues. I'll come to our conclusions very quickly in a moment, but it is about what is changing. And we think that this, from the German government, when we did something similar to this for the Auswärtiges in Berlin back in early, under the Dutch presidency in about May of 2016, Thomas Bagger, who was then the head of policy planning, he said, what we're struggling with, even in Berlin, even in the Chancellery, is to understand that this is the end of tranquility. And that was after the migration crisis in Germany. The difficulty of those in dark suits with dark ties, whether men or women, the difficulty that even the most distinguished and the most qualified of people inside governments and in corporates were having, coming to grip with the kind of scale of what is happening. And I just put this up so you can have a bit of fun, but it is about this, about what, this is from The Economist, about what Trump is doing. But we started down this track, I started down this track in 2014, and Chris joined me a few months later. We signalled things like Trump, but most people didn't want to believe us, because of the pushback against the system from so many people, which you take for granted. Look at what else is happening with what we saw in Quebec at the G7 meeting, with the kind of disparaging relationship that emerged between the president on the right and John Bolton as well, and Chancellor Merkel and others. But more importantly, what happened after that? The communique within 2 hours was thrown to the wind. And what Die Welt said, and others are now beginning to say, that this is the end of the West. It's about changing the way in which we are thinking. So much of what we're going to say is damn obvious, and many of you are familiar with it. But as we say, the most obvious, in many ways, is the most elusive in this new environment. And what we want to do with you tonight is, as one big corporate said to us, come to us, and governments have said this as well behind closed doors, come to us and help us to turn on the light bulbs, to make people at every level, not just those at the top, but lower down, understand that this is a different environment in which to do business, in which we've got to lead as a corporate leader, in which we've got to lead as a senior public servant, and of course ministers have to lead as well. It is about a world which is changing so damn fast in ways which all of you know so well. And what we'd like you to feel is that this is a brainstorming. We don't have a board, I don't think, but see your table as a brainstorm, because you can probably add something new. Yes, we published a book earlier this year, about 4 months ago. We wrote 100,000 words in 3 months and published within 2 weeks, simply because the world is moving so damn fast. And this is not to necessarily ask you to buy the book, but it is about codifying, capturing the speed of change that there is out there. And it's damn difficult if you're writing a book, because the world is already moving on. But we signaled much of what we're going to talk to you about tonight then, and in the previous 3 to 4 years.
Can I just make a point? And we've done a book, and now we're continuing the research. We have a website and a social media platform. So this is an ongoing conversation, and we want you to be part of that process.
But this is a red screen, because we would put to you, and with many of you with ex officio here and having your own views, particularly because of the kind of work you're doing, but this is really now a red alert for leadership. I started down this track when I was doing that, and I could feel back in the beginning of 2014 that something big was taking place. Now, of course, you kind of take it for granted with the challenge to the rules-based system, the international order, the way in which so much of what has been built since the end of the Second World War, including the Bretton Woods Agreement, is now becoming unbundled. But back in 2014, as I was leaving the BBC, most people thought we were smoking something when we said there is a new normal emerging. And of course, it started for one particular reason. So what we want to do is pull back the drapes a little bit to help you sort of appreciate the enormity of what is happening, because it is about this one man. It's about what Putin did. And it's about what Putin did in eastern Ukraine. It's about what Putin did, again, in Crimea. And therefore, there's a symmetry to what we're doing because of the developments literally in the last 48 hours in there. The Strait of Kerch, because that's a result of what happened at the beginning of 2014, the end of 2013, the Vilnius summit of the European Union, which agreed to an association agreement being put to Ukraine, which of course inflamed, infuriated Putin, and the result is what's happening in eastern Ukraine at the moment, and is now happening in the Strait of Kerch. That's 5 years on, but we now have the first military engagement between Russian forces and Ukrainian forces officially. That is sinister. We now have a martial law being declared for 30 days in Ukraine as well. Who was imagining that that would happen? Was it thinkable or was it unthinkable? So that's really the framing which we want to give you, that what we started on, and this happened as I was leaving the BBC, we can see is a new normal, and it's potentially an existential threat to corporates and in government and governance. Let me put that on the table right from the beginning. But look how fast everything is changing in this new environment. Look at where we were a year ago with the Me Too movement. Imagine 18 months ago if we'd been meeting, would we have been predicting that so many corporates and so much government and so many institutions would be decimated by the outrageous behaviour of men towards women, and particularly the fact that most people thought they could get away with it? Those days are over, but would we have been talking as openly about it? Would we have been indicating, and would we have been saying this is an unthinkable? It's unpalatable, but we now have to be addressing it in the way that we now see is happening, with so many careers being destroyed, even in the Nobel Institute of all places, where the Nobel Prize for Literature had to be abandoned because so many people inside the Nobel institution were guilty of inappropriate behavior. And look what's just happened at Google. Gmail, which most of us are using, was used internally to mobilize those inside the company, a wealthy company, one of the richest 5, to actually go out, step out and protest about massive payoffs for inappropriate behavior in ways which are well publicized now. But look at the way in which 20,000 people, not just in one office, but right around the world, decided to voice their anger at an organization which is one of the wealthiest, which doesn't mean to say it has the greatest wisdom. And they are some of the best paid people in the world. Something big is changing, and it's changing so fast. Would we have been talking a year ago about the first chemical weapon attack on European soil? So this is the framing which Chris and I are bringing to you today. And that's the spirit in which we very much like you to think that you are brainstorming with us. But the red alert, why a red alert? Tomorrow is the ESPAS conference, and that's why we're here as well. And 2 years ago, we gave a brief summary of where we've got to, and most people were kind of cagey about what we were saying at the beginning of the conference. But one of the people there was Jeff Malkin, who is the chief executive of Nesta, formerly in number 10 in Tony Blair's administration. But he came out with a very important thing which we've used frequently in the last 2 years. It's about how leadership is conditioned only by zombie orthodoxies. And so let's give you now our conclusion, based on hundreds of interviews. It's all been independently reviewed and verified and peer-reviewed, with leaders, civil servants, corporate leaders, C-suite executives, more than 500. We've got thousands of pages of transcript. The main finding we've got is the conformity which qualifies you for the top now disqualifies you in many ways from appreciating the enormity of disruption and the implications for you as a leader. Because the conditioning which has got you to the top doesn't prepare you for what you've got to think about in this new level of disruption. And surely that's what we're seeing in Hungary, in Poland, in Sweden, even in France now, what we're seeing in Italy. It's the pushback, as we call it. We don't call it populism. I know some of you are studying populism. We call it pushback. Pushback against the systems which have really failed, many of those who are now pushing back against the systems. We are now talking potentially about existential threats for corporates and governments. Existential threats. It's not us who are saying that, it's the people we're interviewing. The corporate leaders who are saying, we're worried that our corporate will not survive in this new environment. We're hearing from leading public servants, and it's not to do with Brexit. It's far deeper and more strategic than that. It's about those leaders saying, we fear that actually the systems which we are running are not equipped, both in terms of the way they're structured, but more importantly, in the way the considerations are being made at the top, for the enormity of what is happening in the pushback by the public particularly, and also in the corporate sector. The likes of Indra Nooyi from Pepsi, who's just retired, saying we as corporates are in danger of creating angry citizens and angry consumers, which could kill our company extraordinarily quickly. So it's moving incredibly quickly into a new normal, which we first identified 4 years ago. And of course, you take it for granted now. But we would suggest to you, and that's why coming to a place like this is important, that we're really only in the foothills of the enormity of the mountain that's ahead of us. Because though there are many out there who are in denial and saying, it's a blip, we would put to you that we don't believe that is the case. That is not a realistic planning assumption, that this is just a blip and it'll return. And Bob Kagan has just written a book about the jungle growing back. You may want to disagree with him, but we don't take the Piketty view, which is, or the other view, which is actually we're still in a period of great wealth and great prospect, that much could turn around because the middle class could be hollowed out by the end of certain jobs and because of the power of AI. So we're talking about new vulnerabilities, but above all, and our only interest in and why we've been invited here this evening, I think, is about the human capacity. The human capacity to handle all of this. And it's not just us who are saying that, it's actually the interviewees. We could have stopped this 2 years ago if we'd felt that actually there was nothing more to do. It's even worse now than when we started for reasons which we can get into. But here, and some of you will have heard him say this, here is Ian Conn, who's the chief executive of Centrica, which is the main gas provider in Britain. It's not in great shape at the moment. But he chose to say at the Brussels Forum what many others are saying privately to us, which we obviously can't source. This kind of language, it's moving too fast. It's revolution, not evolution. There are many accelerations at once. One of the biggest problems is the difficulty of mankind to cope with it. I don't know whether political leaders or business leaders can easily handle it. And there's a cross-fertilization going on here, which is where I want to take Chris to take over. It's about not just in government, It is about the corporate sector and what everyone can learn from the other sectors. Everyone now is vulnerable. And it's not us who is saying that. We're reflecting what those at the top have told us privately. They're using the word fear. They're using the word overwhelmed. They're volunteering it. They're worried about the short term. And they're worried about the survivability of stability. The survivability of stability. Chris, let's move on with what the British Academy is doing in the United Kingdom.
Well, it's just one example of the process of change. I suspect for most of us in this room, all of us probably, the idea that leaders are unable to cope and the world is complex is not a radical idea. What is remarkable how new, this is still a new idea for many leaders, and how what we're trying to do is what we've done is go behind the bubble of what leaders are thinking. Not what they're saying publicly, we're talking to them privately. As Nick said, we've got about 2,500 pages of transcript, many hours of interviews which we've analysed using the best social science methodology and data. And what we're trying to do is just present briefly before we have a conversation about what do we do about it, is just give you a sense of what we've picked up from leaders not just in the UK, not just in Europe, also North America and Asia, across different sectors. But just one of the things we're picking up now is how now, behind closed doors, leaders are talking about things that are probably very obvious to all of us in this room, which is capitalism doesn't work. And that's self-evident since the financial crash and before. So this is just one initiative by an establishment body in the UK, the British Academy, with Oxford Business School. A particular event was held in the Guildhall, which is right in the centre of the City of London. A number of financiers were there, but what was most interesting was how the opening presenter, the guy behind it, is Professor Colin Mayer from the Oxford Business School, who's just got a book out looking at the future of capitalism. And he was able to say, if we can just run the quote, "Mistrust in business is profound, pervasive and persistent." And he was doing that with the Secretary of State for Business next to him, looking rather surprised. But what was remarkable was business leaders. There was a very interesting business leader from Sweden, a major Swedish corporate, business leaders from Germany, as well as a number of people from the City of London, agreeing and having a conversation about how the project should go forward to think about new forms of capitalism. Things probably we could all talk about in this room, but here are people who are captains of industry in different countries, in different parts of the world, talking about this. And we just want to bring that to you as an interesting example of how the world is changing. There's another group run by Lady de Rothschild, who claims there are now 50 groups at elite level talking about the future of capitalism. So what we're doing here, I think, is just bringing to this discussion how there are these intriguing conversations going on, while I think all of us are in the same boat of trying to work out what is wrong with the current system with inequality, particularly when we look ahead with automation and with AI. How is the rewards of that extraordinary technology going to be shared? Just to a narrow elite, to the role of China, or to certain of the major American companies, or how do we share that? That's why when people like Colin Mayer talk about purpose being a key part of what a modern company has to have at the heart of its operation, is really important when we start to having some of those really big socio-economic, political issues about the future of the new technologies that are really just around the corner.
And what is remarkable is the number of people at the heart of these organisations who are being very open to us. It's almost like a ventilation, they're relieved. And we say this not too loosely, but it's a bit like alcoholics. No one wants to admit they're an alcoholic. But then in a group like this, and I'm not saying anyone here is afflicted by this, but in a group of executives, all of them peers, one of them will say, I've got a problem, and then suddenly they all say, we've got a problem too. So it's about finding a new emboldening and how they can thrive on change. And dispensing with leaders is not necessarily the way forward. Some of the successes in the case studies we've got in our book, and which we've been working on, actually come from people who've stayed in their job and remained in their job for an awful long time, because they understand the nature of what is happening.
But the key thing is they've changed.
This, though, could easily be mistrust in politics. Mistrust in government is, as described there, is profound, pervasive, and persistent. So there's a convergence here of the challenge for leadership, which we've tried to push back on. We've tried to challenge some of the stuff we've been told. And no, the answer has always been, no, that's the way we feel. You've got to understand it's tough being at the top. It always has been. But now it's even more difficult. And perhaps we could underscore that with the scale of the challenge that is out there. The scale of the challenge and the way the way it's composed, as highlighted to us by one person, Chris Donnelly, the director of the Institute for Statecraft. And he used to work here in NATO and also in Brussels and elsewhere. But it's a great way of putting it, to try and crystallize what we're bringing to you tonight. The scale of change we're going through at the moment is comparable to what happens in wartime. Yet we think we're at peace. The global pace of change is overcoming the capacity of national and international institutions. Let's just underline that. Comparable to what happens in wartime. Overcoming the capacity of national and international institutions. In other words, conformity is being stretched beyond its capability to handle this. This is not a criticism, it's an analysis. And it's not just us who are saying that. It's not just people like Chris. The new Chief of Defence in the United Kingdom, General Sir Nik Carter, we've got a chapter on him and the way he tried to reform the British Army. He describes it like this: trying to reform things now and take head on the kind of challenges we face as leaders is like eating an elephant in one mouthful. It's an enormous prospect. Everything needs to be done, but simply you can't do it on the scale that is necessary and at the speed that's necessary. And what's fascinating to us is the number of those who've just left their positions of power and responsibility, who are talking openly and very frankly about what has to be done. One of them is Lord Nick Macpherson. He's now a Lord, who used to run the Treasury in Britain. And what he said when he left his job as one of the most senior civil servants in the United Kingdom is the following: I see myself as a number of people in finance ministries, blah, 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 who failed to see the crisis of 2007, 2008 coming, who failed to spot the build-up of risk. This was a monumental collective intellectual error. We can quote him because we would say that quantifies and begins to define the scale of what we're here to discuss tonight. The intellectual error of not actually seeing the enormity of what's coming down the track.
And I went to a couple of events commemorating the financial crash in September. I talked to the Chancellor at the time, Alistair Darling, and said, what do you think of this quote? And he said, Nick is a friend of mine, how could I possibly disagree with him?
And he was the Chancellor of the Exchequer.
And his successor, I then spoke to Ed Balls, I spoke to at another event, who, again, this sense of how we need to understand and introspect. And he's out of government, he's out of politics these days. He's a dancer on a dance show, or he was at Christmas time.
He's also a fellow at Harvard.
Indeed, he has a day job, just to try and introspect about what went wrong, why things were so badly misunderstood at the time.
So let's try and give you the challenge about how you handle this. What we've seen, we're simplifying here in order to make a point, and we go into this a lot more in what's essentially an extended paper, which is something which we're keeping topping up. It's about how you create the space and the voice within organizations for mavericks. Now, you can define mavericks in whichever way you want, but what about what had happened in the European Union in November 2013 over Putin? How many maverick voices were there saying, let's not go for the association agreement, which will provoke Putin and lead us down this track? Now, let's not get into the granular issues there. But were there enough maverick voices questioning a certain level of orthodoxy? Because if you write people off as, no, he or she is a maverick, that can be very demeaning. It can also be very dismissive. It can also be career limiting as well. When actually the kind of person you need for this is a visionary. The maverick who's actually the visionary internally. How do you give that person the space and the clout and the ability to feel, I've got to say that? And this is what introduces a second important element to our work. And it's epitomized by, we have two forwards. One by Lord Stern of climate change, and one by a 30-year-old, Aniket Shah. So we've got two forwards underscoring one thing. This is about the next generation. It's about how the next generation, we heard it only today, in Brussels at a big institution. How the next generation is frustrated by the treacle, is frustrated by the permafrost, is frustrated by the resistance there is because of the constant sense of hierarchy, which is not allowing stuff to get through, which needs to be expressed. And we see this as we've been to many institutions and organizations where we've seen that happening time after time. Deep frustrations. It's not just ageist. It's also about institutions where too many people have been there for too long and are looking to their pensions. It's as simple as this, and their pensions and their equity and their share options as well. They won't get out of the way for obvious reasons. And they're worried about talking about this because they think it will affect their brand and their reputation and their career. This is a very human thing. But if we see the scale of the leadership crisis, that these are some of the reasons why there are blockages. So what is needed? And we could go on stupid, that's a stupid idea. No, it's a sage idea. We heard one chairman say that was a wacky idea. We said, no, you shouldn't be using that one word, it should be wise idea. To encourage this kind of thing generationally, to get rid of the hierarchy, to allow there to be a bottom-up push from the next generation. That's something which comes through in our case studies. And our case studies from Morocco, from Singapore, where I was last week, are important because it shows that the next generation can have a hand in this and is not just naive and callow. So what is needed? And that's where I think we can begin to open up with discussion. What is needed in all of this? It's about a new awareness. It's about a new thinking. It's about new attitudes. It's about a new culture, mindset, and behavior. It's about a new receptiveness to accepting that conformity is a serious problem, to modify what you do and how you do it at the top. That may sound idealistic, but if we're only in the foothills, then something damn quick has got to be done about this. Because if we're talking about the implosion of the capitalist system by the admission of people at the top, I can show you much more about that, coming through from 100 chief executives who I saw talking about this in Battery Park in New York last September. It's coming through loud and clear from the B team as well. It's coming through from other organizations. There's a convergence of anxiety which is beginning to emerge, especially from the people at the top themselves. So those are the kind of things that are needed, and let's try and bring that out in discussion. And we talk about the 5 progressions, which again may seem so damn obvious, but I come back to what we said at the beginning. It's so damn obvious, but the obvious is often the most elusive. We call it the 5 progressions here. How you drop that in institutionally to an organization, and we heard it today at a particular organization, one of many. How you understanding the cost of conformity, understanding the cost of the status quo. When I hear a chief executive say, we've got to revolutionize my massive company, I then meet executive vice presidents, deputy presidents, people just below him or her, below the C-suite saying, he can say that, but we're resistant to that. We don't like what he's doing. You can see where the institutional problems are, and that's just one example. Secondly, audit the external reality. The Strait of Kerch. What's happening with Russia? What's happening with China? What's happening with skills and AI? What's happening with the pushback from the public? Because there are many companies still who don't believe geopolitics should be part of their assessments for corporate wealth. It's quite extraordinary. Even the chief executive of global chief executive of PwC, Bob Moritz, said at Davos in January earlier this year, he said, we've got the greatest optimism we've ever had in the chief executive survey, but let me warn all of you, what's coming down the track is rather different to what you see at the moment, because you're not thinking about geopolitics, and that's a big resistor. Thirdly, audit the internal reality. Where is the permafrost? Where is the treacle? How do you encourage them to change? Can you get them to change? Because if you don't take that on, then you're in trouble. Embrace and address your challenges, but above all, learn how to thrive on change. So those are the kind of things we wanted to put on the agenda. But let us just, as a final sort of reality check, go to one set of quotes from one person who will be known to most of you, the chief executive of Siemens, Joe Kaeser. He said this to us 2 years ago, but didn't want to be quoted publicly, but he was really encouraging us down the track of what we were doing in our interim report of 2016. He said, this is really dangerous time. Now he's gone on the record and said the following: if we get the revolution right, digitization will benefit nearly 10 billion humans inhabiting our planet by 2050. If we get it wrong, societies will be divided into winners and losers. Social unrest and anarchy will arise. The glue that holds societies and communities together will disintegrate, and citizens will no longer believe that governments are able to fulfill their purpose of enforcing the rule of law and providing security. So that comes from one of the global chief executives of one of the most successful engineering companies as GE goes down the tubes. So we put that on the agenda for you. This is an urgency. Digitization is fantastic, but AI is going to hollow out the middle class potentially. But are the governments able to do this? Are the political class able to understand the enormity of what is happening? Because we've said to a couple of national security advisors, you actually shouldn't be national security advisor in name, worrying about Russian missiles and so on. You should actually be national stability advisor about how to retain stability internally within the country that you are serving in the government of. Let's stop there.
Thank you very much, Nick. I'm Heather Graby from Open Society, and it's great to be with you this evening. Now, Nick and Chris have laid out this evening and in their book some really major challenges, not just about what corporations and governments and many other organisations are focused on, but how they work and how their internal culture works, and how much that can inhibit rather than to foster innovation, and particularly the visionaries who are so much needed. So what I'd like to invite you to do is now, on your tables, to spend about 20 minutes, so you can really go into depth and everybody will have a chance to speak, reflecting on how you have seen that happening in your own organisation. So that might be your workplace, it might be your family. Families are small organisations in themselves, or it might also be in an NGO you're involved with, or something else. But in an environment you know well, where do you see the 5 progressions not happening, and how might they happen? It might be good actually to go back to that slide. So what is it that encourages mavericks or visionaries to speak out, and what is it that inhibits them from doing so? How do you see this happening? Do you see conformity and status quo as being costless often? Is there an auditing of the external and internal realities? How would you embrace and address challenges? How would you thrive on change? So within your own experience, because this is about human beings, and Nick and Chris have been interviewing people who are in charge of very large organisations and huge amounts of money, but we see this at every scale of human endeavour, human activity. What is it that's happening there? So let's get some collective intelligence and collective wisdom from the room in terms of your own experiences. We'll come back to you in 20 minutes. There's more drinks available outside, should you need them. There's also copies of the book if you need inspiration. And then we will see what there is here in this room and in this particular...
And Heather, could we encourage pushback if people disagree,
yes,
please?
Absolutely. If you find that there are other issues that you think are more important, it's really important to bring those out. If you think that there are other inhibiting factors that are not captured here, or indeed other things that could be done, this is really interesting. This is a live experiment. This is about how it's working. And also consider what pressures will come onto the organisation that you know best by the challenges that are coming down the track. So digital, as Nick was saying, climate, which comes up over and over again in these interviews, these are going to cause huge pressures in our societies. How might your organisation, large, small, close to home, far away, how is it going to cope with them? How might these progressions happen? Okay, we'll come back to you in 20 minutes.